Senior Associate in the regulatory team here at Walker Morris. Today I'm joined by my colleague Grace Stirrat, who is an associate in our team as well. So Grace, I think the first thing that we need to think about, this isn't an area of environmental law that people will come across necessarily all the time. So what is it that we mean by habitat and biodiversity management?
So when we talk about habitat and biodiversity management, we mean ensuring that there's a plan in place that considers the wildlife and nature in a given area. So this will capture anything to do with the area you operate in, from wild animals, insects, microorganisms, to forestry and also plant life as well. Management of this is integral to avoiding major impacts within your business and the environment. Ensuring you're aware of potential issues and solutions in habitat conservation and biodiversity requirements is also essential to avoid any unwanted regulatory intervention. Some of the most common issues that you're likely to come across are tree preservation orders, hedgerows, protected plants and species such as bats, newts, dormice, and also protected sites such as special protection areas, which typically protect areas for birds, special areas of conservation, which protect all kinds of habitats and species, and also special sites of scientific interests as well. While this will mostly affect developers, it's not necessarily just an issue for them. Private homeowners who are wishing to convert their loft might have bats in there, so something they need to consider as well as other industries like farming, especially in terms of biodiversity net gain. Ecologists obviously need to think about this on a day-to-day basis, and conservation charities as well.
So Grace, what are the sorts of things that we need to think about when we're, if you're a development company, for example, or even, like you mentioned earlier, a residential homeowner who has come across sort of biodiversity issues or protected habitats? What are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about from the outset?
I think the first one is timing. The impact that habitats and biodiversity issue could have on the timing of your project is quite important. If you find a protected species in place during the kind of construction process, then you'll need to stop what you're doing and potentially look to engage ecologists. And this could have an impact on your other contracts. If you're due to have other people come in, that's going to impact your contract with them. So it's really important, if you can, to think about this early on to avoid unwanted delays as the issue progresses. And the other issue is seasonal restrictions. So if you've got hedgerows that need to be removed, you can only do this at certain times of the year. And similarly, if you think that you're going to need a protected species survey and you're going to need to engage an ecologist, then depending on the type of species, there's restrictions on what time of year that they can do full surveys as well. So this can potentially impact the licensing process and have a big delay on your timing. Also, taking steps to ensure regulatory compliance can take some time. As I kind of touched on before, if you need to get a protected species license, you're likely going to need to engage an ecologist if you haven't already. Finding the right ecologist can take some time as well, because your ecologist won't necessarily just be involved in the licensing aspect, and they'll most likely have to be involved throughout the planning process. So you need to make sure that you take the time to find an ecologist that is right for your project and right for you. Preparing the application itself is also a lengthy process, and even potentially deciding if one is required. It's not always black and white. You might need to obtain legal advice. You might need advice from your ecologist on whether or not you actually need to submit the application. You'll also might potentially want to consider if there's a district licensing scheme available, which can be a bit quicker but also more costly. So there's a lot of factors to weigh up in terms of getting the regulatory approvals. If you're looking to develop near a protected site and there's a possibility that your site could have an impact on that protected site in combination with other projects, then it's likely that a local council will ask you to prepare a shadow HRA. Again, that's not a quick process, and you'll have to engage relevant expertise. It could even involve air quality experts, not just an ecologist, to help you with that. And if you do find yourself going down the derogation tests, which of course we all want to avoid, that could be a lengthy negotiation with your local council on how to find a way forward.
Where would you, when would you advise that if you're a developer, for example, would you recommend that you get your ecologist and start thinking about habitat and biodiversity issues right from the very outset? So at sort of site acquisition phase or planning stages, what sort of time do you think is the best time to think about these things?
I think as soon as you can, really, and because it will help you manage your costs as well, which I will go on to. But as soon as you can get an ecologist and your experts involved, the better. Hopefully they'll tell you that all of this is not needed, but you always need to be prepared. Biodiversity offsetting could also be available to the developer, which could involve, instead of offering things on site, off-site alternatives, and I'll go into that a bit more later as well. So the next thing that you need to consider is costs. So ensuring compliance can be costly. There's costs involved with the application process if you need to obtain a license. Costs involved with engaging all the third parties you need. You might want legal advice if it's a bit of a difficult application. You might want your legal advisors to assist with that as well, which all adds up in costs. So it's better to be prepared early on. So the initial reports and engagement might cost you some money, but ultimately that's better than unwanted intervention from a regulator and unwanted fines. It may also be the case, as I briefly touched on, that other third parties are needed, which will obviously have cost implications, and your ecologist might not just be needed from the start, but they might be needed throughout the process in terms of making sure that any compensation is delivered. Often this extends post-development, so it's not just a case of you get your license and you're done. There's more costs that extend post-development as well, so you need to make sure you're prepared for them. And of course, there might be costs involved with delivering the compensation, mitigation, back roofs. You might be asked to put in extra ponds. You might find yourself having to go get biodiversity credits from elsewhere, which is all costs that you need to consider.
Presumably, although there'll be costs in doing all this work up front, getting the surveys, working out what's on site, I'm guessing that will be more cost effective to get that done at the early stage, even if you don't have to then do much with it, rather than not consider these issues from the outset and potentially have to stop work on site because you've found newts on the site or dormice or what have you. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're potentially frustrating your other contracts down the line as well if you're not prepared. So definitely better to get the costs done now. And also, as I said, you want to avoid any unwelcome fines, particularly with a lot of developers now being on greenfield sites. You might have some activists in the village that are aware there's protected species on site, so more likely to cause you some disruption and potentially go to a regulator as well.
Yeah, and like you say, obviously the costs of having to pause development or potentially discovering an issue when it's out of season and you're not able to immediately rehome the species or put in protective measures could ultimately delay your project for months, couldn't it? And not be able to do anything on site during that time.
Yeah, exactly.
So obviously you've touched on the sort of costs and timing implications for managing habitat and biodiversity issues. Why is it so important for companies to make sure that they get this right if it is something that's going to affect their business?
I think reputation's really important. Environmental issues are a massive hot topic, and they have been for a while now. More and more companies are getting environmental policies and doing what they can for the environment and using that as part of their PR and marketing campaigns. So the last thing you want is negative in the press about you saying that you've received an unlimited fine, and it does happen. They do get published on the news. They will publish who you are as well. So it will potentially have a big negative impact on anyone. Also potentially affect your ability to retain the best talent. A lot of young people nowadays are looking more and more at the environment. It's a bigger issue for them, and they will potentially think twice about whether or not to join your company if you've got a big enforcement history with the regulator. So it's just really important for your reputation to make sure that you're doing all you can to avoid any unwanted negative attention. And also the obvious one is the penalties that you're looking at. So wildlife offences in the UK that protect all species, birds, habitats, all sorts, include criminal and civil convictions. So this can include an unlimited fine and also potentially prison time as well. And also trying to kind of negotiate a solution with the regulator can often be more costly. They might be asking you to deliver more compensation than you perhaps would have had you have just done things right in the first place. So it's really important not to get to that stage where you are having to engage with the regulator or even the police on something that's occurred. And the last thing that's important is the biodiversity net gain. From November this year, biodiversity net gain is going to become compulsory in the UK. This will provide a requirement for new development to achieve at least a 10% biodiversity gain increase from the site's pre-development biodiversity value. It's also important that the provisions contain anti-trashing provisions, which are in place essentially to prevent landowners from reducing the biodiversity value of the land. And if a local authority finds that any clearance activities have taken place before the 30th of January 2020, it's quite a wide window, the value will be taken as the pre-clearance biodiversity value. So this is really important for people buying the land as well, to make sure that the landowner hasn't undertaken any clearance activities that could potentially catch them out, and they could potentially be looking at delivering a bigger gain than they had anticipated due to the biodiversity value of the land. And while it's not mandatory yet, a lot of local authorities are starting to already require you to deliver a 10% net gain. So for many people, this will already be an issue that they're familiar with and something they're having to deliver. It's important to kind of consider this early because there are different options available. You don't necessarily have to deliver the gain on your own land. There's biodiversity credits out there, so it's important to think about this issue early so that you can look at all the options available and choose what's right for you.